Hey, Stewart's Chapel. This is Don Pierson, and this is Don Counts behind the camera. We're at the Counts home. Appreciate their hospitality. This is September the 7th, Tuesday, September the 7th, devotion, and we are in early in a series of devotions on being burden bearers. I'm going to read Ephesians 15 and 16. I may have even read these verses to you before. I actually want to tell a story, actually two stories, but in relationship to this one. Now, when I read this passage, you're going to think, what's that got to do with being a burden bearer? Just stay with me. It says in verse 15, it says, "See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil," making the most of the time, redeeming, buying back the time by the way we walk and act. This first story is not mine. I borrowed it. I don't even know. In fact, where I borrowed it, I'm sure it was borrowed as well. It's been going around a while, and the truth is no one probably knows where it first started. But the story tells of a man who is heavy laden. He's burdened. There's a burden in his life, and doesn't even tell in the story what the man's burden is, but it's weighing heavy on him. And he's sitting outside and he's staring down at his feet. And it's a very, very dry time in his area. The ground is heavily cracked because of the dryness. I remember in Belize during the dry season, the ground would dry up so much, and it would crack up, literally leaving holes where you could stick your hand down in it. But then in the rainy season, it would quickly come right back together. Anyway, this is a dry season in physically, but also emotionally and spiritually for this man. He's in a dry season. He's staring down at the dry ground and the crack. He notices an ant. An ant is carrying a piece of straw. And he's watching this ant. The straw is so much larger than this ant. And the ant is having to pull, and every now and then that straw will get stuck on something, but he'll pull and he'll work with it until it gets released. And the man's watching the ant because the ant is moving in the direction of a giant crack that he can literally stick his finger in the ground. And he's thinking that poor ant's going to fall into that crevice. He was going to help the ant, but then all of a sudden he noticed something. The ant is very much aware that the crevice is there. The ant turns, drops the straw, moves to the very back of the piece of straw, and he starts moving, and he pushes the straw out over the crevice until the straw is now laying from across the crevice as a bridge. And the ant walks across the straw to the other side, grabs the straw, and just keeps on going on his journey, carrying the burden. That ant had came to an obstacle that to most people would have looked like it was impossible, and would have thought, well, I'm just going to leave my burden behind. The story went on to tell how the man realized that there are times this particular burden for him is very, very heavy and a very dry ground. But it was like the Lord spoke to him and said, use your burden as a bridge. And you'll not only get over what is going on, you'll get beyond. You'll get beyond. I have the story I'm going to tell you is it's not really about anybody. It's actually mine. There was a period of time a few years ago before I came to Stewart's Chapel where spiritually, emotionally, physically, I was depleted. My calling was still heavy on my shoulder, and so I was still carrying it. but I didn't have much energy. I felt like I was working against everything. It was a very, very dry land for me. It seemed like every little thing that I encountered was a major obstacle. I didn't know about this ant story then. I had never heard this story that I just shared with you at that time. But I think now, as I look back at it, how many times it was like God just picked me up and put me on the other side, and other times the calling would become a bridge, and I would experience life by, in the midst of using what God has called me to, my burden, and He began to renew me. When God brought me to Stewart's Chapel, God has taken that same burden, that same calling, and He has refreshed me many, many times. There are still times of dryness in my life, but I hear God say, you keep carrying it, you keep going. I got the crevices and I've got the dryness. Let me ask you something. I don't know where you are spiritually in your journey. I don't know whether this is a very dry time. I don't know whether you've left your burden back somewhere. You just said, you know what, I'm done with it. It's not worth it. And you're walking. Have you noticed that if you've done that, the ground in the season hasn't got wetter? In fact, you may not have the burden, but you're probably even more weary now without it than you were with it. You know that you not only abandon your burden, but you abandon God. I think God intends for us to redeem the time. Now there's many, many purposes for this passage about redeeming the time, for the days are able. You see what it means is the days work against us. The enemy's constantly working against us, whether it be crevices in the ground or a dry season. He's constantly working against us. But God says, you know what? You redeem it. You turn your eyes upon me and you keep on going. And guess what? I think God lays down. I think God lays down over those crevices. And we find ourselves literally using Him as the bridge to get us to the other side. Love you, Stewart's Chapel.